Hi, my name's Michael, and this is Maker's Workshop. Today, I'm going to make a coffee table with a built-in Lazy Susan out of branches that came down in my yard. Let's get started. I'm using wood from down branches in my yard that I previously milled and dried. I ran each through the drum sander to flatten them. And then cut one flat edge on each using the bandsaw. Since the table was going to be wider than the bandsaw, I grouped and prepped branches into two separate smaller glue-ups so I could resaw them after they dried. I stacked each bundle onto parallel bar clamps and coated each branch liberally with Titebond 3 wood glue. I then squeezed my clamps together and allowed this to dry completely overnight. The next day, I removed the bumps from the squeezed out glue off of the flat side of the hardened panels to give me a flatter edge to handle on the bandsaw. I first took off a thin sliver from each panel to give me an even reference edge. And then sliced off a panel about 1.5 inches thick. I repeated this with the other panel, and then placed my two panels back onto the parallel bar clamps to be glued together, again with a healthy coat of Titebond 3. While that dried, I made a design on easel to carve out the Lazy Susan using our X-Carve CNC router. This was a really simple design, just a circle inside of the square tabletop. I used the table saw to create a flat reference edge on my dried panel to allow me to load it into my CNC router with precision. And then I ran the carve. I'm using a 1/8 inch drill bit here, as I thought that would be a good amount of wiggle room for the spinning Lazy Susan. After carving, it was back to the wood shop to remove the tabs. And then a quick drum sand to flatten the top. Alright, so I just talked to my sister, and what we're going to do is we're going to build a frame for the table out of this slab of cherry. We're going to have about 1 inch on the front and back and about 3 inches of cherry on either side, so it'll become a little more rectangular. I was just in their living room the other day, and I think that this new size adjustment will make it a much more functional piece for their house. The cherry slab I was using was pretty warped, so I thought it would be easier for me to cut it into long strips first on the table saw. From there, I cut the pieces into smaller sections and marked each side with a pencil. I squared them off using the joiner. I knew it was flat once all the pencil was gone from each side. Then, I drum sanded the other dimension of each piece. Once square, I cut them all down to a uniform size to work with. Then, I played around with the cherry border until I was happy with the balance of the finished look. Alright, what if I cut this in half and kept the pinwheel?
On one side? Or on both sides?
We got pretty indecisive on this one. But once I decided on design, I set up another glue up on the parallel bar clamps. Once the glue dried, I sanded the next two edges with a random orbital sander, so I had a nice flat edge to glue the next two sides of the cherry border to. So this joint being an end grain to a side grain is going to be pretty weak, but we're not going to worry about that quite yet. We're going to remedy that later when we mount the frame to the table. So at this point, the tabletop is looking pretty good. I'm just going to remove the excess glue, starting with a card scraper, and then moving on to my random orbital sander with a 60 grit. A good card scraper makes really quick work of removing material quickly and cleanly. A quick palm sand, and I had a pretty smooth tabletop. However, as I did this, a bunch of bug tracks popped to the surface in the branch pieces. This is to be expected with downed wood, but would need to be addressed later on. However, at this point, I was ready to change gears and start working on making a metal base. I wrapped my square stock with painter's tape to make it really easy to get a uniform cut on multiple pieces. I then ground down the ends to a taper. This will help hold the weld when we assemble this in a minute. I placed 2 tacks on each seam to construct my initial square. Once I had those set, I filled the seams in with full welds. Why did you feel the need to go over there?
I don't know.
All right, so we want to try to get this done tomorrow. So we have a very busy day ahead of us. We need to get the rest of the bug tracks picked out of this so that we can fill it with resin, and need to finish welding together the metal base.
Do you want me on bug tracks?
That sounds good.
Okay, so I'll do bug tracks. You can weld.
Perfect. Bug tracks in wood are pretty easy to spot, and sometimes they have a chalky consistency. They come up pretty easily with an awl. This is also a good time to pull out any loose knots in the wood. Once everything was cleaned out, Brooke used the random orbital sander to smooth everything out and get rid of any last glue residue before filling the voids with resin. Putting painter's tape on the back side of the table keeps any resin from seeping through. Brooke mixed up some Titebond 2-to-1 epoxy with a medium hardener. This is our favorite for filling cracks. It needs to sit overnight to harden up. While Brooke did that, I got to work on adding the legs to the table base. I cut my pieces down to length on the chop saw, tapered the ends, and then tack welded them into place, keeping things square as I went. So I have 3 tack welds on each one of the joints, and now I'm just going to flip it over so that we can make sure it's level and make any adjustments before running our full beads. From here, I just cruised along and ran full beads along each seam. I'm using flux core wire, so once I completed the welding, it needed quite a bit of cleanup with my angle grinder and an abrasive pad. After cleaning it up, I mixed up some Bondo to take care of the large holes on the sides of the table base. I heavily globbed it on the perimeter of each hole, and then after letting it harden up just a bit, filled the holes in the rest of the way. After letting it harden for about 20 minutes, I sanded the Bondo down with a random orbital sander, also sanding along the full surface of the piece. At this point, the bulk of the structure of the table was done, and it was down to just making both parts look pretty before assembly. I squared off the edges of the tabletop with a jigsaw, and then Brooke scraped off the bulk of the resin using a scraper. While she did that, I put a coat of black primer onto the base. I then drilled holes into the frame for attaching the 2 pieces together later on, and widened all of them with a step bit. I gave it another quick hand sand and then wiped down the base with acetone to clean it off before applying the final coat of black spray paint. It's wet outside, so it's going to take a bit longer to dry, but we'll get it done. Back inside, Brooke was hitting the tabletop with a final drum sand. She filled the void on the underside of the table with some scrap MDF to ensure an even sanding job.
So when I was sanding it, more popped out, so I thought it was done, but it's not.
No!
It's not my fault. It's just the wood. Basically, we just have to pick out the bug tracks and then put a little more resin in and then like...
A little?
Well, do you see any other spots?
So many. There.
That's one?
There.
Oh shoot, I missed that one.
There.
It's not me that did it though. I'm being too hard on myself.
You did do it.
No, the wood.
You were the one putting it through the machine.
Hey, if you're going back to resin, you might as well find all the holes.
Let's see.
That's what she's doing.
I'm doing? You're not gonna help me?
Nope. So at this point, I've used the card scraper to scrape off the excess resin, and now I'm just going to use the random orbital sander at a 120 grit to remove what's left of the excess resin so that I can move on to squaring up the edges, since we just used the jigsaw to trim off those extra pieces. I sanded the tabletop up to a 220 grit and then ran the edges through the joiner. After that, I used my router table to make those edges just a little bit softer. And at this point, it was ready for the finish. So I cleaned off any excess sawdust with paint thinner. Once that dried, I dumped on the first coat of satin White Bond poly. I worked this into place with a clean cloth. After the first coat dried, I sanded it lightly with a 220 grit sandpaper and applied a second coat off camera. To attach the tabletop to the base, I marked where those holes in the metal were onto the wood. I then drilled a pilot hole in each spot so I could screw the two components together. I sealed off the seam with caulking to create a watertight bond for the next step. For the outer rim, I mixed up some resin and dumped it into the seam. Remember that end grain to side grain part of the glue up? This resin will make a strong bond between the wood and the metal, but also take care of reinforcing that otherwise weak seam. Getting the Lazy Susan into place was probably the most challenging part of this whole build because it needed to be perfectly centered. I had an extra piece of the glued up branches that I cut down to size and then added a notch so that it would sit evenly below the cutout in the table. I then marked the arc of the circle onto the brace piece so I could route out an inset in the center of where the Lazy Susan would sit. This needed to be wide enough for the hardware to rotate around freely. Then I found and marked the center of the circular piece while adding guidelines for myself. I lined everything up in place carefully and then piece by piece screwed everything into place. This was easily the most time-consuming part of the build because any potential error would be quite obvious once someone went to spin the Lazy Susan. I used a combination of CA glue and wood glue to add a little extra hold to the brace piece before screwing it into place. And from here, I was able to easily access the bottom of the Lazy Susan to screw that into place as well. I double checked that it spun well, and then put feet on the bottom of the legs. And then it was done and ready for delivery.
Ready for my close-up.
You're on. You really like these lights. I feel like it's like bringing out another side of you. Like, who is he?
Can you stop talking?
Okay.
Okay. I actually installed the table in my sister's house last week, so I don't have it with me right now, but it filled the space very nicely and looked great in the room. If you found any of this video helpful, go ahead and click subscribe. We have a lot of fun builds coming up that we're very much looking forward to sharing with you. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.